Hello, my dear friends. There is something strangely human about creating something temporary and then never letting it go. In the medieval world, many institutions, rules, taxes, and traditions were introduced as short-term solutions to immediate problems. A war needed funding. A plague required emergency control. A king needed stability. A church required order. And so leaders declared new systems with the simple understanding that they would last only until the crisis passed. But crises passed, and the systems remained. To understand how this happened, we must step gently into the medieval mindset. The Middle Ages were not a frozen, primitive era. They were a time of constant adjustment. Kingdoms rose and fell. Borders shifted. Famines arrived without warning. Disease spread silently. In such a world, temporary measures felt practical. No one imagined they were building permanent foundations. They were simply solving today's emergency. Take taxation, for example. In medieval England, kings often introduced special taxes to fund wars, particularly wars in France. These were not meant to become routine. A ruler would call upon his subjects and say that extraordinary circumstances required extraordinary contribution. A temporary levy would be collected to support soldiers, ships, and supplies. Once victory was achieved, or once peace was signed, the tax was supposed to disappear. But something curious happened. The machinery built to collect that tax, the record-keeping, the local officials, the accounting structures, proved useful. Once a kingdom realizes it can systematically extract revenue from its population, it becomes difficult to abandon that system entirely. Wars returned. Tensions resurfaced. Funding was always needed. Over time, emergency taxation evolved into structured, predictable taxation. What began as crisis funding became part of everyday governance. The same pattern appeared in military organization. In early medieval Europe, armies were often assembled temporarily. A lord would call his vassals. Farmers would leave their fields for a short campaign. The expectation was that once the conflict ended, men would return to normal life. Warfare was seasonal, brief, and reactive. Yet as kingdoms stabilized and conflicts became more complex, rulers began maintaining standing forces, small at first, but increasingly permanent. Guard units remained active year-round. Fortifications required constant staffing. Temporary defense arrangements slowly transformed into long-term military infrastructure. The castle itself, originally a rapid solution to invasion threats, became a lasting architectural symbol of power. Even the medieval university followed this pattern. When the first universities emerged in places like Bologna, Paris, and Oxford, they were not designed as permanent educational empires. They were gatherings of scholars and students, loosely organized for practical instruction in law, theology, or medicine. Many early institutions operated without fixed buildings. They were mobile, adaptable, and temporary in spirit. But over time, their utility became undeniable. Formalized learning strengthened church authority and royal administration. Scholars trained bureaucrats. Law schools produced judges. The temporary gatherings crystallized into enduring institutions. Universities became permanent fixtures in European society, shaping intellectual life for centuries. And then there were social regulations. During times of plague, cities imposed emergency controls, restrictions on movement, market regulation, sanitation rules. These were meant to last only until disease subsided. But once governments experienced the power of regulating urban life, some controls persisted. Market supervision became routine. Quarantine measures became standardized practice. The temporary management of crisis laid groundwork for structured public administration. Even clothing laws, sumptuary laws, often began as short-term moral corrections. Authorities worried that social boundaries were blurring. Merchants dressed like nobles. Prosperity created confusion about rank. So temporary rules were issued limiting fabrics, colors, or ornamentation by class. These were framed as necessary adjustments. Yet such laws returned again and again, reinforcing hierarchy through regulation. What was meant to calm a moment of anxiety became part of a long-term effort to define social identity. Perhaps one of the clearest examples lies within the Church itself. Certain doctrinal measures initially introduced to combat heresy in specific regions evolved into permanent structures. The Inquisition, for example, was not conceived as a universal, timeless institution. It began as a targeted response to particular movements viewed as threats to orthodoxy, but over time, its mechanisms expanded, formalized, and institutionalized. What was once a localized corrective effort became a durable component of ecclesiastical governance. The medieval world reveals a quiet truth. Temporary solutions often create systems. Systems create habits. Habits create permanence. It was not always intentional. Rarely did a king announce that a temporary measure would become eternal. Instead, permanence emerged gradually, almost invisibly. The crisis passed, but the administrative framework remained useful. Dismantling it would require effort. And in a world already full of instability, few leaders chose to dismantle working systems. As we move deeper into this topic, we will see this pattern repeat across feudal obligations, church authority, urban charters, military fortifications, and even emergency labor arrangements introduced after the Black Death. The Middle Ages were filled with improvisation, but improvisation, when repeated often enough, becomes structure. And so the story of temporary medieval things that never went away is not a story of deception. It is a story of adaptation hardening into tradition. As we move further into the medieval world, we begin to notice that one of the most powerful examples of something meant to be temporary, but that became permanent, was the feudal obligation itself. Feudalism did not begin as a grand, carefully designed system intended to define centuries of European life. It emerged from insecurity. In the centuries following the collapse of centralized Roman authority and the environmental and demographic shocks of late antiquity, rulers struggled to maintain control over fragmented territories. External invasions from Vikings, Magyars, and Muslim raiders created an atmosphere of constant danger. In response, landowners and local strongmen offered protection to nearby communities in exchange for loyalty and service. At first, this arrangement was practical and reactive. A farmer needed protection this season. A lord needed fighters this year. Oaths were personal, immediate, and often informal. The understanding was simple: protection for service for as long as danger lasted. But danger rarely vanished entirely. Raids returned, borders shifted, rival lords fought each other. Over time, what began as temporary mutual defense hardened into structured obligation. Vassals were no longer simply neighbors seeking short-term safety. They became legally bound to provide military service for a specified number of days each year. These arrangements were recorded, witnessed, and inherited. Land grants that were once conditional became hereditary fiefs. Service that was once flexible became codified. Within generations, feudal relationships were no longer emergency measures. They were the framework of medieval society. A system born from insecurity became the normal order of things. A similar pattern can be seen in castle construction. In the early medieval period, wooden fortifications were often erected quickly in response to immediate threats. A motte and bailey castle could be constructed rapidly, using local labor and timber. These early fortifications were not always intended as permanent symbols of domination. They were defensive reactions to raids or rebellion. Yet once built, they reshaped landscapes and power structures. Stone replaced wood. Temporary earthworks became massive fortresses. Castles became administrative centers, symbols of authority, and lasting fixtures of regional control. What began as short-term defense against Viking raids evolved into permanent architectural statements of feudal power. Emergency labor regulations after the Black Death offer another striking example. When the plague swept through Europe in the 14th century, killing perhaps a third to half of the population in some regions, the labor market changed overnight. Workers were suddenly scarce. Wages began to rise as survivors demanded better compensation. Landowners and governments, alarmed by this shift in economic balance, introduced temporary wage controls. In England, the Ordinance of Labourers in 1349 and the Statute of Labourers in 1351 attempted to freeze wages at pre-plague levels. These laws were explicitly framed as emergency responses to extraordinary demographic crisis. They were meant to stabilize society during a time of shock. Yet the impulse to regulate labor did not disappear when the worst of the plague subsided. Authorities continued to intervene in wage disputes and worker mobility for decades. Attempts to control economic freedom became part of governance. Although enforcement varied and resistance grew, especially during events like the Peasants' Revolt of 1381, the precedent had been set. The idea that governments could and should regulate labor markets during instability became embedded in medieval political thinking. What began as temporary crisis management influenced long-term economic policy. Church practices reveal similar developments. Certain church taxes, such as the tithe, were originally framed within specific contexts of sustaining clergy and local parishes. While religious contribution had long roots, the formalization and enforcement of tithe collection intensified during periods of institutional consolidation. Measures introduced to stabilize church income during political or economic uncertainty gradually became permanent obligations. Once systems of collection, record-keeping, and enforcement were established, they rarely vanished. Institutional survival depended on revenue stability, and stability favored permanence. Urban regulations provide another example of temporary measures that endured. Medieval towns often introduced curfews during times of unrest or external threat. A bell would ring at night signaling that fires must be covered and citizens should remain indoors. Initially, these were precautionary measures to prevent fire or maintain order during unstable periods. But in many cities, curfews became routine. The nightly ringing of bells evolved into a permanent rhythm of urban life. What was once emergency discipline became daily structure. Even guild systems followed this pattern. Craft guilds emerged in part to regulate trade quality and protect artisans from unfair competition. In some cases, guild restrictions intensified during times of economic uncertainty to stabilize markets. Temporary limitations on production or pricing became institutionalized rules governing entire professions. Over time, guild membership defined identity, career paths, and social status. Systems intended to guard against short-term instability shaped centuries of urban economic life. One of the clearest lessons from these developments is that infrastructure, once built, resists dismantling. Administrative offices, tax collectors, fortified walls, legal codes, all require effort to create. Once they function, abandoning them feels risky. Leaders in the medieval world often faced constant uncertainty. If a temporary measure worked once, it was easier to keep it than to gamble on dismantling it. Permanence emerged not necessarily from tyranny or deliberate manipulation, but from caution and practicality. Psychologically, temporary measures also provided reassurance. In a world frequently shaken by war, famine, and disease, predictable systems created a sense of order. Even if those systems had begun as emergency responses, their continuation offered stability. People adapted to them. Generations grew up knowing no alternative. What had once felt restrictive became familiar. Familiarity became tradition. The medieval period, often imagined as rigid and static, was in fact deeply shaped by improvisation that hardened into structure. Crisis bred innovation. Innovation became administration. Administration became tradition. From feudal service to wage laws, from castles to curfews, from church taxation to guild regulation, the pattern repeats. Something introduced to solve a momentary problem remained long after that moment passed. And so, as we continue exploring medieval things that were supposed to be temporary but never went away, we begin to see that permanence is rarely declared. It grows quietly, rooted in fear, necessity, and survival. The Middle Ages remind us that history is often shaped not only by grand vision, but by emergency decisions that simply proved too useful to undo. As we continue deeper into the medieval world, one of the most powerful examples of temporary measures becoming permanent can be found in the expansion of royal authority during moments of crisis. Medieval kings were not originally absolute rulers. Their power was limited by custom, noble privilege, church authority, and local tradition. In many early kingdoms, a ruler relied heavily on personal relationships and negotiated loyalty. Authority was fluid, not centralized. But crisis has a way of concentrating power, even if only for a while. During wars, rebellions, or succession disputes, kings frequently claimed extraordinary powers. They imposed emergency levies, bypassed traditional councils, and expanded their control over justice and taxation. These actions were framed as necessary responses to immediate danger. When a kingdom faced invasion, few objected to stronger leadership. When rebellion threatened stability, extraordinary enforcement felt justified. The language of urgency always softened resistance. Yet once the machinery of expanded authority was constructed, it rarely returned fully to its earlier limits. Royal courts grew in scope, legal systems centralized, record-keeping increased. tax collection became more efficient. Each crisis strengthened the crown's administrative reach. Over generations, what had begun as temporary wartime authority evolved into structured monarchy. In England, for example, the development of royal courts and common law accelerated during periods of instability. Initially, kings traveled to dispense justice personally, especially when disputes threatened order. Over time, the practice became institutionalized. Permanent courts formed. Written legal precedents accumulated. Systems created to stabilize disorder became enduring frameworks of governance. Even when immediate crisis passed, centralized law remained. France experienced similar developments. The Capetian kings began with relatively weak direct control beyond their immediate lands, but through repeated military campaigns and succession challenges, they expanded royal authority bit by bit. Temporary wartime taxation became routine revenue streams. Royal officials were appointed to oversee territories once governed by local nobles. Over time, the monarchy solidified power that would later culminate in far more centralized rule. Another striking example lies in emergency financial measures. Medieval rulers often borrowed heavily during war. To secure loans, they sometimes granted temporary privileges to merchants or cities. Tax exemptions, trade monopolies, or political charters were issued as short-term incentives. But these privileges frequently outlived the crisis that created them. Merchant communities grew stronger. Cities gained autonomy. Temporary concessions shifted long-term balance between crown and commerce. The church followed a similar pattern during religious disputes. When heretical movements appeared in particular regions, church authorities established special courts to investigate and correct deviation. These tribunals were justified as targeted responses to localized threats. However, once procedural systems were established, records, interrogations, legal definitions of orthodoxy, they were applied more broadly. Structures initially designed for containment expanded into regularized institutions. What began as temporary doctrinal defense became permanent ecclesiastical oversight. Wartime surveillance also provides a revealing example. During conflicts, rulers monitored potential internal enemies more closely. Messengers were watched. Suspicious gatherings were investigated. Certain populations were required to swear loyalty publicly. While framed as defensive measures against rebellion, such systems often persisted beyond immediate conflict. Administrative memory does not fade easily. Once officials learn how to gather information effectively, that capacity tends to remain. Urban governance also transformed under pressure. In cities facing unrest or external threat, councils were granted emergency powers to regulate trade, enforce curfews, or oversee food supplies. Once those councils proved effective, their authority solidified. Municipal charters formalized their jurisdiction. Town governance, initially reactive, became permanent civic structure. Even coinage reforms followed this trajectory. During periods of financial crisis, rulers might temporarily debase currency to stretch resources. Though often controversial, such adjustments established new monetary standards that influenced long-term economic practice. Financial improvisation shaped structural policy. The medieval world demonstrates that temporary power expansions rarely disappear entirely. Once administrative networks grow, they generate their own momentum. Officials depend on their offices. Systems require maintenance. Revenue streams fund further expansion. The inertia of governance favors continuity. It is important to understand that permanence did not always result from manipulation or tyranny. Often it arose from practicality. Leaders faced constant instability, war, plague, famine, succession conflict. Dismantling a working system felt dangerous. If emergency authority had once saved the kingdom, why risk removing it? Over time, crisis management blurred into ordinary governance. Generations born into these systems rarely questioned their origin. Attacks once described as exceptional became ordinary. A court once created for special cases became the primary source of justice. A surveillance practice once justified by war became part of standard administration. Memory of the temporary nature faded. In this way, the medieval period reveals a quiet transformation of power. It was not always dramatic or deliberate. It accumulated through layers of response to instability. Each emergency left behind infrastructure. Each infrastructure reshaped balance. The Middle Ages remind us that temporary solutions often build the future more powerfully than long-term plans. What was meant to last a season can endure for centuries. As we move further into the fabric of medieval life, one of the clearest examples of temporary measures that refuse to disappear can be found in responses to disease, especially during times of plague. Medieval societies were no strangers to illness, but when epidemics struck with overwhelming force, especially during the Black Death in the 14th century, authorities acted quickly and often harshly. Their actions were framed as emergency precautions, short-term restrictions meant to preserve life until danger passed. Yet many of these measures quietly embedded themselves into the long-term structure of European governance. When plague reached port cities, rulers and councils introduced quarantine policies. Ships arriving from infected regions were forced to wait offshore for set periods before docking. The term quarantine itself comes from the Italian 40 giorni, 40 days, a waiting period imposed to prevent contagion. At first, this was a desperate reaction to a terrifying and poorly understood disease. No one imagined that such controls would become routine parts of maritime regulation. But once the practice proved effective, it persisted. Even when plague waves subsided, quarantine systems remained ready to activate. Over time, permanent health boards were established in cities like Venice and Florence. What began as temporary isolation became institutionalized public health administration. Similarly, travel restrictions appeared during outbreaks. Town gates were closed. Rural villages restricted entry to outsiders. Markets were monitored. These were introduced as short-term defensive actions. Yet they strengthened the concept that authorities could regulate movement in the name of safety. Once such controls existed, they could be reintroduced whenever new threats appeared. The idea that governments had the right to suspend normal freedoms during crisis became part of medieval political reality. Food regulation followed a similar path. During famine or supply shortages, cities imposed price controls on grain and bread. Officials inspected markets to prevent hoarding. Emergency grain reserves were established. Although these measures were often declared temporary, many cities continued regulating staple food prices long after immediate famine passed. Market oversight became a permanent civic responsibility. The fear of instability ensured that food supply remained under watchful authority. Border controls also expanded during times of conflict or instability. In early medieval Europe, borders were often fluid. Trade and travel crossed loosely defined territories. But during prolonged wars, rulers imposed tighter supervision over crossings. demanding documentation or allegiance. While such controls were introduced for security, the administrative framework they created lingered. Over generations, kingdoms developed clearer boundaries and bureaucratic systems to manage them. Temporary wartime monitoring contributed to the long-term evolution of territorial states. Another powerful example lies in coinage regulation during economic crisis. When currency instability threatened trade, rulers sometimes centralized minting authority as an emergency corrective measure. In theory, such centralization addressed specific financial disruptions. In practice, it reinforced royal control over economic life. Once centralized minting proved effective, rulers rarely returned that authority to decentralized systems. Monetary regulation became a permanent aspect of sovereign power. Guild restrictions offer another case of short-term control becoming structural. During economic downturns or sudden population shifts, guilds limited entry into trades to protect existing members from competition. These restrictions were often justified as temporary measures to stabilize markets. But once established, guild monopolies solidified. Entry fees rose. Apprenticeship systems became rigid. Professional identity became hereditary in some cases. The original crisis faded, but the barriers remained. Even sumptuary laws, rules regulating clothing and consumption, often began as temporary moral corrections during times of social anxiety. When economic change blurred class distinctions, authorities reacted by issuing regulations limiting who could wear certain fabrics or display certain luxuries. These laws were framed as restoring order to a society momentarily unsettled. Yet such regulations reappeared repeatedly, shaping social identity long after the original tension subsided. One of the most telling examples involves emergency taxation for crusades. When popes called for crusades, special levies were imposed on clergy and laity to fund military expeditions. These were clearly framed as temporary contributions to a holy cause. But the mechanisms for collecting church taxes became more refined with each campaign. Administrative structures built to gather crusading funds remained available for other uses. Financial centralization strengthened papal authority long beyond the original military objective. Psychologically, medieval society adapted quickly to these retained measures. Once a practice survived beyond its initial purpose, it began to feel normal. New generations assumed that such systems had always existed. Rarely did people question whether a tax, restriction, or administrative office had once been described as temporary. Memory of its provisional origin faded into routine. What makes the medieval period particularly revealing is the constant presence of crisis. War, famine, disease, and succession disputes were not rare interruptions. They were recurring features of life. In such an environment, emergency systems were activated repeatedly. Each activation reinforced their legitimacy. Over time, the boundary between temporary and permanent blurred entirely. The medieval world therefore became layered with structures born from urgency. Plague regulations evolved into public health systems. Wartime taxation became fiscal normality. Emergency courts became standard judicial institutions. Curfews became nightly tradition. Border controls became territorial identity. None of these transformations happened overnight. They unfolded slowly, often unnoticed by those living through them. But the cumulative effect reshaped society in lasting ways. Temporary measures rarely leave quietly. They root themselves in infrastructure, in habit, in law, and once rooted, they grow into the ordinary fabric of governance. As we move deeper into the medieval world, we begin to see that some of the most powerful temporary measures were not about war or plague, but about control of labor, morality, belief, and daily behavior. These were often introduced during moments of instability, justified as necessary corrections to restore order. Yet once implemented, they rarely disappeared. Instead, they hardened into expectations that shaped medieval society for centuries. After the Black Death reduced Europe's population so drastically, labor became precious. Survivors recognized their new leverage. Wages rose. Workers moved from manor to manor seeking better terms. Landowners and governments reacted quickly. As mentioned earlier, England introduced the Statute of Labourers in 1351 to freeze wages at pre-plague levels and prevent workers from leaving their assigned employers. The law was framed as emergency stabilization. Officials feared economic chaos if wages rose unchecked. They argued that this intervention was temporary, a necessary step until society recovered, but enforcement mechanisms lingered. Courts heard cases against laborers accused of demanding excessive wages. Movement restrictions remained part of governance. Even when demographic conditions shifted over time, the precedent of regulating labor through law endured. Across Europe, rulers increasingly intervened in economic life during crises, and those interventions built the idea that government oversight of work was acceptable. What began as short-term reaction to plague became long-term habit of regulation. Religious enforcement followed a similar path. During periods of doctrinal anxiety, when heretical groups appeared, or when reform movements challenged church authority, temporary tribunals were established to investigate and correct deviation. These inquisitorial systems were justified as targeted responses to specific threats. Yet the procedures created, documentation, interrogation methods, local informants, standardized legal definitions of heresy, formed durable frameworks. Once the Church developed mechanisms to investigate belief systematically, those mechanisms remained part of institutional structure. The urgency faded, but the tools stayed. Moral regulation in towns also illustrates this pattern. During times of social disruption, authorities tightened control over taverns, gambling houses, and prostitution. Ordinances were issued limiting opening hours, banning certain games, or regulating red light districts. These rules were often described as temporary responses to unrest or economic distress. Leaders argued that vice flourished in unstable times and required containment. Yet over generations, urban authorities retained these controls. Licensing systems became permanent. Surveillance of public behavior intensified. Municipal records show repeated renewals of what were once emergency restrictions. Moral discipline became embedded in civic governance, shaping everyday life long after the original crisis ended. Even serfdom itself evolved through this process. In early medieval Europe, many peasants were technically free but bound by custom and protection agreements. During times of invasion and instability, seeking the protection of a lord offered safety. Temporary dependence for protection could gradually become hereditary obligation. Over time, economic insecurity and legal codification formalized peasant ties to land. What may have begun as practical arrangements hardened into long-term status. By the High Medieval period, serfdom was a defining feature of rural society in many regions. Currency debasement offers another example. When rulers faced financial strain, especially during war, they sometimes reduced the precious metal content in coinage to stretch resources. Initially justified as a short-term measure to fund urgent needs, debasement often altered monetary standards more permanently. Once new coins circulated widely, reversing the change was difficult. Trust in currency required stability, but stability required consistent policy. Temporary financial improvisation left lasting marks on economic systems. Military service obligations also expanded beyond their original limits. Feudal contracts often required vassals to provide a specific number of days of military service annually. During prolonged campaigns, kings extended these obligations or demanded additional financial compensation instead. Over time, such adjustments normalized longer service or monetary substitution. The system became more structured and predictable, less a personal arrangement and more a formal requirement embedded in law. Another subtle but powerful example lies in record keeping. During times of crisis, and especially taxation drives or legal disputes, governments improved documentation. Surveys were conducted, land was measured, populations were recorded. England's Domesday Book in 1086, though not tied to a single short-term emergency, reflected the growing impulse to catalog and control resources systematically. Once record-keeping expanded, it rarely contracted. Bureaucracy tends to accumulate rather than dissolve. The medieval pattern is clear. Crisis demanded organization. Organization required structure. Structure generated permanence. What is particularly revealing is how these systems became self-reinforcing. A tax required officials to collect it. Those officials required salaries. Salaries required revenue. Revenue required continued taxation. A court required judges and clerks. Clerks required records. Records required archives. Over time, the infrastructure built for temporary need created its own necessity. Generations born into these structures rarely questioned their origins. A curfew bell felt ancient even if it had begun only decades earlier. A guild restriction seemed traditional, though it emerged from a specific economic shock. A church court felt eternal, though it had been designed for targeted response. The medieval world was therefore layered with inherited emergency. It was a society shaped not only by long-term planning, but by repeated reaction to instability. Each reaction left behind residue: administrative, legal, architectural, economic. Temporary measures did not simply survive. They shaped identity. They defined hierarchy. They structured power. And as centuries passed, the memory of their temporary intention disappeared entirely, leaving behind institutions that felt as old as the world itself. As we move further into the deeper layers of medieval society, one of the most striking examples of something meant to be temporary, but that became permanent, can be found in fortifications and military infrastructure. In the early medieval centuries, fortresses were often constructed in direct response to immediate threats. Viking raids struck coastal towns with little warning. Magyar horsemen swept across Central Europe. Muslim fleets attacked Mediterranean shores. Communities needed protection quickly. Wooden palisades were raised. Earth mounds were shaped into defensive platforms. Watchtowers were built to signal danger. These were emergency reactions, meant to secure survival during periods of vulnerability. Yet once constructed, fortifications changed power dynamics permanently. A fortified site attracted settlement. Markets formed under the safety of walls. Lords established administrative centers within castles. Over time, temporary wooden defenses were replaced with stone keeps and curtain walls. What began as improvised protection evolved into enduring symbols of authority and control. Castles were no longer just shields against invasion. They became instruments of dominance over local populations. Their permanence reshaped landscapes and political hierarchies. The logic behind keeping them was simple. Even when a particular invasion threat faded, the memory of vulnerability remained. Removing a castle felt dangerous. Its presence offered reassurance. Generations grew accustomed to living in the shadow of towers that had once been built in haste. Eventually, the emergency rationale disappeared, but the structure remained embedded in geography and governance. The expansion of royal councils followed a similar path. During moments of political instability, kings often convened broader assemblies of nobles and clergy to secure support. These gatherings were initially reactive, a way to legitimize urgent decisions, raise funds, or rally defense. However, once councils proved useful, they evolved into more regular institutions. In England, the development of Parliament began partly as a means of securing taxation consent during war. What started as episodic consultation gradually hardened into expectation. The Crown could not easily abandon the mechanism it had helped create. Temporary consultation became structural representation. Church authority expanded in comparable ways during times of doctrinal anxiety. When disputes arose about orthodoxy or church discipline, synods were called to address specific issues. These gatherings, meant to resolve immediate tensions, increasingly produced standardized canon law. Over centuries, collections of church law grew more comprehensive and systematic. What began as targeted correction became a codified legal tradition governing marriage, inheritance, moral conduct, and clerical behavior. The Church's jurisdiction expanded far beyond its initial emergency mandates. Another revealing example lies in border fortification and taxation tied to defense. During prolonged frontier conflicts, such as those between Christian kingdoms and Muslim territories in Iberia, rulers imposed temporary levies to support frontier defense. Military orders like the Knights Templar and the Knights Hospitaller were established to protect pilgrims and defend vulnerable regions. These orders were founded in response to specific threats, yet they evolved into permanent military religious institutions with extensive land holdings, financial networks, and political influence across Europe. Even when the original conditions shifted, the orders continued operating, deeply embedded in the structure of medieval power. In urban environments, emergency watch systems were introduced during times of unrest. Night watches patrolled streets to prevent fire, theft, or rebellion. At first, these were reactive measures tied to specific fears. Over time, they became standardized civic functions. Cities institutionalized watch rotations, paid guards, and surveillance routines. The practice of organized urban policing, though primitive by modern standards, took root through repetition of emergency measures. Feudal scutage, the practice of paying money instead of providing military service, also began as a pragmatic solution when vassals could not personally serve in distant campaigns. Initially flexible and occasional, scutage payments grew more regular and predictable. Monarchs recognized the financial efficiency of monetary substitution. Gradually, the option to commute service to payment became structured fiscal policy. What was once improvisation became normalized revenue. Even architectural responses to fire, one of the greatest dangers in medieval towns, show the pattern. After devastating urban fires, authorities sometimes imposed temporary building restrictions, requiring stone construction instead of wood in certain areas. These measures were justified as necessary to prevent recurrence. Over time, stone construction became expected in key districts. Urban planning shifted permanently due to reactive legislation. The medieval world teaches us that infrastructure resists reversal. Once built, whether in stone, parchment, or habit, it acquires inertia. Dismantling a castle required resources and risk. Abolishing a council required surrendering a useful tool. Eliminating a tax required replacing lost revenue. Each system, even if born from emergency, integrated itself into broader networks of power and expectation. It is also important to recognize how fear preserved permanence. Medieval societies lived with memory of invasion, famine, and plague. Even when conditions improved, collective anxiety lingered. Removing protective structures felt reckless. Leaders preferred continuity over uncertainty. In that preference, temporary arrangements crystallized into enduring institutions. Generations raised under these systems rarely perceived them as temporary at all. A castle seemed eternal. A tax seemed traditional. A council seemed ancient. The origin and crisis faded into obscurity. What remained was structure. And so, across military defense, governance, religious authority, and urban regulation, the medieval world demonstrates a consistent pattern. Emergency response becomes normal order. Systems created to address instability outlive the instability itself. What was supposed to solve a moment becomes foundation for centuries. As we continue moving through the medieval world, one of the most powerful areas where temporary measures became permanent lies in family life, especially in marriage, inheritance, and social hierarchy. These were not abstract systems. They shaped daily existence, determined who owned land, who could marry, who could inherit, and who could rise in status. Many of the rules that governed these intimate aspects of life began as corrective measures, often introduced during moments of tension or instability. Yet over time, they hardened into unshakable tradition. Marriage regulations offer a revealing example. In the early medieval centuries, marriage customs varied widely across regions. Local tradition and family negotiation shaped unions more than centralized authority. However, as the Church expanded its influence, it sought to standardize marriage practice to prevent disputes, clarify inheritance, and enforce moral discipline. Some early restrictions were introduced to address specific problems: clandestine marriages, disputes over legitimacy, or confusion over consanguinity. The Church gradually expanded rules prohibiting marriage within certain degrees of kinship, sometimes extending the forbidden range quite broadly. These regulations were framed as necessary safeguards to preserve social order and prevent scandal. But once codified in canon law, they became permanent fixtures. The Church asserted authority over marriage validity, transforming what had often been a family arrangement into a sacrament regulated by ecclesiastical courts. Over time, marriage law became one of the Church's strongest tools for shaping medieval society. What began as corrective standardization became universal religious jurisdiction over family life. Inheritance law followed a similar trajectory. In times of political instability, rulers often intervened to clarify succession rules to prevent conflict. Temporary adjustments might favor a particular heir or restrict division of land to preserve military strength. In some regions, primogeniture, the practice of granting inheritance primarily to the eldest son, solidified during periods when fragmentation of land threatened noble power. Though not originally universal, primogeniture gradually became entrenched in many parts of Europe. What began as a practical solution to prevent weakening estates hardened into tradition that shaped social hierarchy for centuries. The Black Death intensified these developments. With so many heirs dying unexpectedly, inheritance disputes multiplied. Courts intervened to stabilize succession. Temporary rulings to address demographic chaos influenced broader legal standards. Legal precedents established during crisis continued guiding property transfer long after population levels recovered. Even restrictions on social mobility sometimes originated in anxiety over rapid change. During periods when merchants grew wealthy or urban classes expanded, authorities feared erosion of noble distinction. Sumptuary laws, originally described as temporary measures to curb excessive display, reinforced class boundaries. These regulations limited clothing, jewelry, and luxury goods by social rank. While often difficult to enforce strictly, their repeated issuance normalized the idea that social identity should be visibly regulated. The moral correction of one era became the inherited hierarchy of the next. Religious observance rules followed comparable patterns. During times of perceived moral decline, councils imposed temporary fasting requirements, stricter Sabbath enforcement, or behavioral codes. These were often reactions to specific crises or reform movements. Yet repeated reinforcement embedded them into everyday expectation. What had once been emergency spiritual discipline became regular religious practice. In rural communities, communal obligations sometimes intensified during hardship. Shared grazing rules, forest access restrictions, or water rights adjustments were introduced to manage scarcity. Although framed as short-term solutions to environmental strain, such regulations often persisted, defining village life permanently. Custom became law. Temporary rationing became regulated access. Another subtle but powerful example lies in legal guardianship systems. During war or plague, large numbers of minors were left without parents. Temporary guardianship arrangements were created to protect estates and ensure continuity. Over time, legal frameworks governing guardianship became formalized, influencing property rights and family authority well beyond the crisis that inspired them. The medieval pattern continues to reveal itself. Instability produces intervention. Intervention produces structure. Structure produces permanence. It is rarely dramatic. There is no single decree declaring that a temporary law will endure forever. Instead, repetition normalizes it. Each crisis reinforces the system's usefulness. Each generation inherits it without remembering its provisional beginning. What makes family and social regulation especially significant is how deeply these systems embedded themselves in identity. Marriage rules shaped kinship networks. Inheritance laws defined wealth distribution. Social restrictions determined aspiration and limitation. Once institutionalized, these rules structured life at every level. By the later medieval period, many people could not imagine a society without these frameworks. They felt ancient, sacred, immovable. Yet in many cases, their roots lay in moments of fear, adjustment, or reform centuries earlier. The medieval world reminds us that permanence often grows from reaction. Systems created to solve a short-term tension frequently become defining features of civilization. Over time, memory of their temporary nature disappears, leaving only the structure behind. As we continue moving deeper into the medieval world, we now arrive at something even more subtle but incredibly powerful. Trade controls and monopolies that were introduced as temporary protections but became permanent pillars of economic life. Medieval economies were fragile. Harvest failures, piracy, warfare, and sudden population loss could destabilize markets quickly. In response, rulers and city authorities frequently introduced short-term restrictions meant to protect supply, stabilize prices, or defend local merchants from outside competition. But once these controls were established, they rarely disappeared. Consider trade monopolies granted during wartime. When kingdoms required reliable access to specific goods, salt, iron, wool, grain, rulers often granted exclusive trading rights to certain groups or cities. These monopolies were framed as emergency guarantees. By concentrating trade in trusted hands, authorities could ensure steady taxation and supply during unstable periods. However, once monopolies created wealth and influence for their holders, dismantling them became politically difficult. Merchant elites grew powerful. Guild structures tightened. Cities like Venice, Genoa, and later the Hanseatic League cities transformed emergency privileges into enduring commercial dominance. What began as crisis management became structured economic hierarchy across Europe. The Hanseatic League itself offers a fascinating case. In the 13th century, northern German merchants cooperated temporarily to protect trade routes from piracy and regional instability. Their alliance was pragmatic and defensive. Yet over time, this loose association hardened into a powerful trade network that controlled commerce across the Baltic and North Seas. Temporary collaboration for security evolved into centuries of economic influence. The mechanisms built for protection, convoys, trade agreements, legal privileges, became permanent frameworks of regional power. Financial control followed a similar path. During periods of fiscal strain, rulers sometimes centralized taxation systems to increase efficiency. Temporary oversight offices were established to monitor revenue collection. But once these offices demonstrated their usefulness, they remained. Medieval bureaucracies grew gradually, often justified by emergency need. Record-keeping expanded. Accounting systems improved. The very tools that allowed rulers to respond to crisis strengthened state capacity long-term. Church courts provide another powerful example. Initially, ecclesiastical courts handled specific spiritual matters: marriage disputes, clerical misconduct, heresy. During times of instability, their jurisdiction expanded to resolve conflicts that threatened social order. Over centuries, church courts gained authority over inheritance, morality, and contract disputes in many regions. What began as focused spiritual arbitration became broad legal influence embedded in everyday life. The emergency need to preserve doctrinal unity or moral discipline justified expansion. That expansion rarely reversed. Urban defense leagues also illustrate this pattern. In regions plagued by feuding nobles or unstable monarchies, cities formed defensive alliances for mutual protection. These alliances were pragmatic and reactive. Yet once cooperation proved beneficial, cities institutionalized their agreements. Shared defense became shared policy. Political autonomy increased. Some urban leagues outlasted the conflicts that inspired them by centuries. Even toll collection on roads and bridges began as temporary measures to fund repairs after damage or warfare. Rulers argued that tolls would cease once infrastructure was restored. In practice, toll collection became regularized revenue. Bridges were rebuilt and maintained, but toll systems persisted. Economic life adapted around them. The idea that passage required payment became normalized. Another subtle transformation occurred in written contracts. During times of economic uncertainty, merchants increasingly demanded written agreements to secure transactions. What may have begun as cautious practice during unstable periods evolved into routine documentation. The spread of written contracts strengthened legal culture and institutional trust. A temporary response to insecurity contributed to the long-term development of commercial law. Military taxation linked to crusading campaigns offers yet another example. When popes called for crusades, extraordinary taxes were levied to fund expeditions. These were presented as exceptional contributions to a sacred cause. But once papal authorities refined the machinery of international tax collection, they possessed a powerful administrative tool. The infrastructure built to support crusades did not vanish when campaigns ended. It strengthened central church governance permanently. The pattern continues across regions and institutions. Scarcity produced rationing. Rationing required oversight. Oversight required officials. Officials required continuity. Crisis justified innovation, but innovation created new layers of authority. What is striking is how rarely medieval people consciously intended to create permanent systems. Leaders acted to solve immediate threats. Merchants cooperated to survive instability. Cities restricted trade to prevent collapse. Each decision felt temporary, practical, necessary. But structures have memory. Once built, they accumulate dependence. Over generations, these economic and legal systems shaped the medieval world profoundly. Trade networks solidified into power blocks. Guild monopolies limited competition. Church courts shaped family life. State bureaucracies strengthened taxation. Roads collected tolls long after initial repairs. Alliances endured beyond immediate danger. The medieval experience reveals a truth about governance and society. Temporary controls often outlive the crisis that inspired them, because dismantling them requires confidence in stability. In a world where stability was never guaranteed, leaders preferred keeping protective systems in place. By the late Middle Ages, many of these institutions felt ancient and immovable, yet their roots lay in moments of fear, scarcity, and urgency. The Middle Ages were not static. They were layered with responses to crisis, responses that became tradition. As we move deeper into the medieval centuries, one of the most revealing patterns appears in moments when rulers claimed temporary emergency powers during instability, and then quietly absorbed those powers into the normal structure of governance. In theory, medieval kings ruled by custom and mutual obligation. Their authority was real, but it was negotiated through oaths, councils, and long-standing traditions. When crisis struck, invasion, rebellion, succession disputes, famine, or financial collapse, kings often justified extraordinary authority as a short-term necessity. They would suspend certain privileges, impose new taxes, or override local jurisdictions, explaining that such measures were required only until order was restored. Yet restoring order rarely meant surrendering newly gained tools. Take taxation again, but now from the perspective of political structure rather than simple revenue. During prolonged wars, such as the 100 Years' War between England and France, monarchs introduced extraordinary levies to sustain military campaigns. These taxes were presented as exceptional burdens demanded by extraordinary conflict. However, once rulers established reliable systems of assessment and collection, they discovered something transformative. Predictable taxation strengthened centralized power. Officials were appointed to oversee collection. Records were kept. Legal enforcement mechanisms were expanded. When war paused, the infrastructure remained intact. The machinery of centralized finance did not vanish simply because a treaty had been signed. Future conflicts, even minor ones, justified its continued operation. In France, the taille, originally a feudal levy imposed in specific contexts, evolved into a regular royal tax. It was initially tied to military need, but by the late medieval period, it had become a cornerstone of royal revenue. What began as conditional obligation hardened into expectation. The crown's financial independence from feudal negotiation increased dramatically because of this transformation. A temporary wartime measure became permanent fiscal authority. Royal courts also expanded under similar logic. During disputes that threatened political stability, monarchs sometimes intervened directly, claiming the right to hear cases previously handled by local lords. This intervention was justified as necessary to ensure justice during turbulent times. Over time, however, royal courts accumulated jurisdiction. Subjects increasingly appealed to centralized authority rather than local nobles. The crown's legal reach widened. Once the population experienced the efficiency or perceived fairness of centralized adjudication, the demand for royal justice grew. What began as intervention became expectation. Church reform movements provide another profound example. During the 11th century, reformers within the church sought to address corruption, simony, and clerical marriage. These reforms were framed as urgent corrections to restore spiritual purity. Yet in the process of reform, the papacy strengthened its administrative apparatus. Canon law was systematized. Papal legates traveled widely. Appeals to Rome increased. The papal office, once more localized and limited, expanded its influence across Europe. Reform meant to fix temporary corruption ended by permanently centralizing ecclesiastical power. The Gregorian reform movement illustrates this especially clearly. What began as a moral and spiritual correction reshaped the balance between church and secular rulers. The papacy asserted authority over the appointment of bishops, challenging kings who had long exercised that power. The investiture controversy was not merely a theological debate. It was a struggle over authority that permanently altered the structure of medieval governance. Emergency moral correction produced enduring institutional transformation. Military organization underwent a similar shift. During times of immediate threat, rulers often hired mercenaries to supplement feudal levies. Mercenaries were initially short-term solutions when vassal obligations proved insufficient. Yet as warfare grew more complex and prolonged, reliance on paid soldiers increased. Maintaining standing companies became advantageous. Financial systems adapted to support them. The gradual transition from purely feudal armies to more professionalized forces began through these temporary wartime adjustments. In urban settings, councils granted emergency powers during famine or unrest, often retained expanded jurisdiction afterward. Market inspection, ration enforcement, and price controls introduced during shortages became regular municipal responsibilities. Citizens accustomed to oversight during crisis gradually accepted its continuation. Even legal definitions hardened through repetition. During times of rebellion, rulers labeled certain acts as treason that previously might have been considered personal disputes. Emergency definitions broadened the scope of what counted as disloyalty. Once codified, those expanded definitions remained part of law. The category of treason grew more structured and enforceable over centuries. What ties all these developments together is the cumulative effect of fear and necessity. Medieval society operated under persistent uncertainty. Stability was fragile. When leaders found tools that helped them navigate crisis, they were reluctant to discard them. Dismantling centralized taxation or relinquishing expanded judicial authority felt risky in a world where the next rebellion or invasion always seemed possible. Generational change also played a crucial role. People born into these expanded systems rarely perceived them as extraordinary. A centralized royal court seemed natural. A standing tax seemed traditional. Papal authority over appointments seemed established fact. Memory of their provisional origin faded. By the late Middle Ages, Europe was shaped by institutions that had once been justified as temporary responses to specific dangers. Stronger monarchies, more centralized churches, more organized urban governments. These were the inherited results of repeated emergency adjustments. The medieval period therefore teaches us that permanence often arises not from deliberate design, but from accumulated response. Crisis legitimizes expansion. Expansion builds infrastructure. Infrastructure generates dependency. Dependency creates continuity. What was supposed to last a season quietly endured for centuries. As we continue moving through the medieval centuries, without closing this journey yet, we begin to see that the deepest and most lasting temporary developments were not always dramatic. They were often administrative habits, quiet adjustments repeated so many times that they became the invisible skeleton of society. The medieval world did not wake up one day and decide to build permanent bureaucracy, rigid hierarchy, centralized courts, or structured taxation. It drifted there slowly, through repetition of emergency measures that proved useful. One of the clearest long-term examples lies in documentation. During crises, especially wars and succession disputes, rulers needed clarity. Who owned which land? Who owed which service? Who had sworn loyalty? In moments of instability, written proof became essential. Surveys were conducted, charters were copied, oaths were recorded. At first, this documentation served immediate security needs. A king wanted to know exactly what resources he could command. A lord wanted evidence of his claim. But once documentation expanded, it became indispensable. Archives grew, royal chancelleries professionalized, Clerks were trained to maintain records. Written authority began to outweigh purely oral custom. Over generations, the habit of recording and preserving information strengthened state capacity permanently. What began as precaution during disorder created the foundations of administrative government. The same pattern appeared in systems of surveillance and loyalty enforcement. During rebellions or foreign invasions, rulers required public oaths of allegiance. Entire populations were compelled to swear loyalty formally. These ceremonies were justified as temporary reaffirmations during danger. Yet the ritual of sworn loyalty became expected practice during transitions of power. The idea that authority required documented consent embedded itself into governance. Even when danger faded, rulers repeated the practice because it reinforced legitimacy. Another revealing transformation occurred in legal uniformity. In early medieval Europe, law varied regionally. Custom shaped justice more than centralized decree. However, during periods of instability, rulers sometimes imposed standardized legal procedures to prevent confusion. Royal judges traveled circuits to ensure consistency. Initially reactive, this effort toward uniformity gradually expanded. The development of common law in England reflects this pattern. What began as an attempt to stabilize justice under royal oversight became a defining feature of English legal identity. The growth of universities followed similar logic. During theological disputes and administrative complexity, trained scholars were increasingly necessary. Temporary gatherings of students and teachers formed around pressing needs for legal and doctrinal clarity. Over time, these communities institutionalized themselves. Permanent faculties emerged. Degrees standardized authority. The university became a fixture, not a temporary response. Military finance also continued evolving through emergency repetition. During prolonged conflicts like the 100 Years' War, rulers experimented with new fiscal mechanisms, loans from merchant banks, state-backed bonds, structured repayment systems. Initially introduced to survive immediate financial strain, these instruments laid groundwork for more sophisticated state finance in later centuries. The machinery of war funding shaped peacetime governance. Even the physical layout of towns changed due to temporary measures. After devastating fires or unrest, city planners sometimes reorganized streets, widened roads, or required specific building materials. These changes were framed as preventative corrections following disaster. But urban design is rarely reversed. What was implemented after crisis became the permanent map of the city, and perhaps most subtly of all, the medieval mindset itself adapted to this cycle of emergency permanence. People grew accustomed to living within systems born from crisis. They accepted curfews, guild monopolies, church oversight, and royal taxation as ordinary features of life. Over time, the distinction between temporary and permanent blurred so completely that it disappeared. What makes this especially significant is that medieval society was not consciously building modernity. There was no coordinated plan to create centralized states, legal codification, or economic regulation. Each layer formed because leaders sought stability in uncertain times. Each decision felt immediate and practical, yet the cumulative result was transformative. By the late medieval period, Europe had stronger monarchies, more organized churches, more structured urban governments, and increasingly sophisticated fiscal systems than it had centuries earlier. These structures were not born from peaceful design. They grew from reaction. Crisis forced improvisation. Improvisation required structure. Structure demanded maintenance. Maintenance created permanence. The medieval world, often imagined as static, was in reality deeply shaped by constant adaptation. And those adaptations, intended to last only as long as danger remained, quietly became the enduring architecture of society. We will continue moving deeper into how these supposedly temporary solutions carried forward into the early modern world, influencing state formation, colonial expansion, financial systems, and even social expectations. Without closing this yet, just extending the thread further into history. As we move into the final stretch of this journey, we can now step back and see the full pattern clearly. The medieval world did not consciously design permanence. It reacted to instability. It responded to invasion, plague, famine, rebellion, and moral panic. Each response felt urgent. Each solution was framed as temporary. Yet repetition turned reaction into structure, and structure into tradition. What began as emergency taxation during war became normalized fiscal policy. What started as short-term labor control after plague shaped economic regulation for generations. What emerged as crisis-based fortification defined political geography for centuries. What developed as temporary church tribunals expanded into lasting ecclesiastical courts. What began as guild protection during instability hardened into economic monopoly. What started as emergency curfew became civic routine. What began as recorded loyalty during rebellion grew into bureaucratic documentation that strengthened centralized states. By the late medieval period, Europe was filled with institutions whose origins lay in fear or necessity. Royal power had expanded through repeated crisis management. Church authority had centralized through reform movements framed as urgent corrections. Urban governments had strengthened through famine regulation and defense coordination. Trade leagues born from insecurity dominated commerce. Legal systems standardized under the pretext of restoring order. None of these transformations happened through a single decree declaring, "This will last forever." They endured because dismantling them felt riskier than maintaining them. Medieval rulers lived in a world where the next disaster always seemed near. To remove a working system, even if originally temporary, invited vulnerability. Stability, even rigid stability, felt safer than experimentation. Generations inherited these systems without memory of their provisional beginnings. A peasant paying tax in the 15th century did not remember that centuries earlier, the levy was described as exceptional. A merchant working within guild restrictions did not recall the famine that justified those controls. A noble swearing fealty to a powerful crown did not see that royal authority had expanded incrementally during successive wars. What had once been improvisation now appeared ancient and unchangeable, and this is perhaps the most important realization. The medieval world teaches us that history is layered with responses to crisis that outlive their original purpose. Temporary structures rarely disappear quietly. They integrate themselves into law, habit, architecture, and belief. Over time, they stop feeling temporary at all. By the time Europe entered the early modern period, many of the foundations of centralized government, regulated economy, institutional church authority, and bureaucratic administration were already firmly in place. not because someone had planned them centuries in advance, but because repeated emergencies had built them piece by piece. The Middle Ages were not simply an era of castles and knights. They were an era of adaptation. And those adaptations, though meant to be short-lived, reshaped political and social order in ways that endured long after the crises faded. So when we look at medieval things that were supposed to be temporary but never went away, we are really looking at a deeper truth about human society. In moments of fear, we build structures to survive. And if those structures work, we keep them. Over time, survival tools become tradition. The medieval world reminds us that permanence is often accidental. It grows from repetition. It grows from caution. It grows from the simple decision not to dismantle something that once provided safety. And so, across taxes, laws, guilds, fortifications, church courts, labor controls, and administrative systems, the story is the same. What was meant to last a season quietly endured for centuries. If you enjoyed this deep dive into how medieval temporary solutions shaped long-term history, like the video, subscribe,